Hello, we're going to be in the book of Amos today. Amos is one of the most exciting books in the Old Testament, and I really believe one that will relate to our society probably as well as any other book in the Old Testament, except possibly Hosea and Ecclesiastes. Amos is one of those books that is a companion book with the book of Hosea. Hosea speaks of God's love that's been hurt. Amos speaks of God's justice that's been broken. And we'll be covering the book of Hosea in the days ahead. Now, Amos is a very rough kind of fellow. There's been much discussion about him. We really don't know a whole lot about him. I'm going to be doing a brief outline, and we'll see how little we know. And everything we know is from the book itself. Amos is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible except in the book that goes by his name. Now, the author was from a town called Tekoa. Tekoa is about, 10 to 12 miles south of Jerusalem in the Judean wilderness. It's about the same amount south as Bethel is going to be north. Let's go to the map if we could then, please. And you'll notice that those two different orange patches, one is on Tekoa, down overlooking the Dead Sea, the Judean wilderness. The northern one is at the city of Bethel. Now that's where the calf worship was for the northern tribes, and Amos is going to be a prophet to the northern tribes, okay? Now, Amos was one of those individuals that said, I'm not a prophet nor the son of the prophet. That comes from chapter 7, verse 14. I don't think he's being so disparaging against the prophets in his day. But as you know, going back in the older parts of the Old Testament, there came to be prophetic guilds, or groups of prophets that lived together, like Elijah and Elisha. And then we learned that later on, these groups of prophets came to be identified with the king, and the king paid them a salary and paid for their food and all those kind of things. And so these prophets became identified with the state. And so I think Amos was saying, I'm not part of the paid clergy, if you please. Now, it also may be that he didn't really feel like he was a part. That was a pretty wild group, I want you to know. One time King Saul went to visit the prophets, and it said he prophesied naked before the Lord all day. Well, friends, you can get a bad sunburn doing that. There were some wild folks over there, I want to tell you. And maybe Amos is saying, I'm just not part of that group. For whatever reason, he just denies that he is a part of the tradition of propheticism within the chosen people. Now notice, if you would, the next one is going to be dealing with the fact that many folks have said he's a poor country bumpkin. Friends, I want to tell you, the book of Amos is some of the best Hebrew in all of the Old Testament. And apparently he recorded himself after he preached it. He is really a man of some education and some literary prowess. And so I don't think he's a country bumpkin at all. And what we know about him is about two different things and then one tradition. We know from Amos, chapter 1, verse 1, that he was a sheep master or sheep herder. Now, that doesn't mean he was a shepherd, because the same word is used in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4, for mesa. So we think he was a sheep owner. He owned these sheep. Now, these were a different kind of sheep because of the use of this word. They were small sheep with a unique kind of wool that was very, very expensive. And so apparently he owned a relatively significant small business. Now, it also says of him in chapter 7, verse 14, that he was a dresser of sycamore trees. Now, when I was a kid, we used to throw these little sycamore balls at each other, but that's not at all what we're talking about. This is really a fig mulberry type of tree. The fruit's about an inch long. It grows in large clusters all over the tree. The tree can sometimes be as tall as 40 feet tall. So here was a guy who took life and limb in hand and crawled out in these limbs, because this unique fruit, and it was not just for the poor. I've read many commentators that say this was the staple diet of the poor. One time in the Psalms, all these trees in Egypt died, and it was a national disaster. So it was a cash crop for all people in society. But every one of the fruits had to be pierced at the bottom, apparently to help the ripening process. They didn't ripen the same. And if you didn't pierce them, they were very watery and didn't taste good. So every little fig, I call it fig mulberry, had to be pierced. And apparently Amos crawled up all over these trees, piercing these little clusters of fruit. And then they would ripen in a very few days after that. Now, we don't know exactly where he did this, because these trees don't grow in the Judean desert. Some have said he had a specially produced or specially prepared parcel of land that was well watered and fertilized, and maybe he kept them there. We don't know. It may have been that part of the year he had to travel to the Jordan River Valley up by Jericho, where some of these trees grow, or over on the Mediterranean coast. We just don't know where he took care of these trees. But apparently he was either an owner or someone who worked for someone who owned these trees. Now, number 4 in the outline that I'm following, you have a copy of, talks about Jewish tradition. Now, the rabbis say that Amos was a well-to-do businessman. Now, I really agree with that. I don't know what kind of education he has. The book doesn't say. But from 2 Samuel 14:2 and following, we know that Tekoa was famous for its wise people. In that particular passage in 2 Samuel, it's a wise lady that someone goes there for counsel. And apparently there was a local, some kind of teaching institution that was of some renown, and possibly Amos was a part of that. Now, even though Amos was from the southern kingdom, a day's walk from Jerusalem, apparently many times he went to Bethel, which is a little bit north of Jerusalem, to sell his wool and stuff. And he became, I guess, greatly concerned with the pomp and circumstance of that place. Now, let's talk about Bethel for a minute. First of all, isn't it amazing how many of God's prophets have come from the wilderness of Judea? I think of John the Baptist, Elijah. Jesus spent a period of time there. It seemed that there's something about that simple life, that rugged life, that when this man went to Bethel and saw the ivory and gold and the religious ritual of that golden calf cult, he was appalled by it. Remember when Jeroboam I pulled the northern 10 tribes away in 922 B.C.? That's when the kingdom split between Jeroboam, the Ephraimite labor leader, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Well, in that 922 B.C., Jeroboam I did not want his people to go back to Jerusalem to worship. He thought they would be unloyal to him. So he set up 2 golden calf shrines, one at Dan in the very north and one at Bethel close to the south, only about 12 or so miles from Jerusalem. The reason was that it was not idolatry, because the golden calf symbolized Yahweh. Remember the golden calf of Aaron in the wilderness? That was not idolatry. That was making graven images. And so Jeroboam I tried to do that. Now the prophets castigate that throughout the literature of the Old Testament. But this was the site in Bethel where apparently Amos went to. We know he preached there. We know he preached in the capital city of Samaria. Pardon me. Let's go, if we could, to the date of the prophecy then, which will be somewhere around 750 B.C. Now, we're plus or minus 10 years, plus or minus 15 years, but we're close at 750 B.C. So, Amos is one of the 8th century prophets. Now, let's see if we can get some evidence for this date. It is amazing to me that out of all the books in the Bible, Amos has the most detailed introduction for the purpose of dating of any Old Testament book. And if you have your Bible close, I hope you have it open to the book of Amos, and I just want to read this to you and show you what I mean. The words of Amos, who was among the sheep herders from Tekoa, which he envisioned in visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Now notice he's trying to date this prophecy in 3 ways. The current king of Judah, the current king of Israel, and the major earthquake that occurred in this part of the world in this time. Now, this earthquake was so severe, there are several allusions to it in the Old Testament. And if it's possible for us to link Zechariah 14:5 with 2 Chronicles 26:16 through 20, the eclipse, if a major eclipse this time is synonymous with the earthquake, which it may well be, then we can date this prophecy exactly. June 15th, 760 B.C. You say, how can they get so specific? Well, you can take these calendars back from different groups, just go back with them. We can't tell if it's 9:30 in the morning or 12 o'clock in the afternoon, but we can pinpoint the date if the eclipse and the earthquake happen together. Now, Uzziah was a good king, and he reigned from 783 to 742. This is Jeroboam II we're talking about, not the first. He reigned from 786 to 746 B.C. And so we have really got this prophet locked in to the dates in the Old Testament. Let's look at the recipients for a minute, if we could. This was a time of great, great prosperity, much like the days of David and Solomon. Now let's see what was happening. As you know, the empires of 2 major civilizations impacted the Promised Land over and over. The two major river valleys in that area, the Tigris and Euphrates, whose headwaters start over in the north of the Promised Land, and the Nile River, who flows to the Mediterranean, very close to the Promised Land. Now, those have been the major centers of civilization. They start with the Sumerians, it goes to the Old Babylons, the Assyrians, the New Babylonian Empire, then it goes to Persia, and then Greece and Rome, and right on up. Now, Assyria is a comer. She is powerful enough to beat Israel's major enemy, which was Syria. Now, yes, Assyria and Syria. Damascus was defeated, but Assyria wasn't strong enough to occupy all her territory. So in this power vacuum, Egypt was strong, but was pretty much staying inside her boundaries. So in this power vacuum, between a balance of power between Assyria and Egypt, Israel and Judah had a real freedom. Israel asserted her influence over all of her northern land, and Judah reasserted her influence over all the southern parts that she had had under King David. The military had never lost a battle during this period. They were very successful. There were a lot of successful businessmen. Also, the religious activity was at a fevered pitch. I want to tell you, the shrines at Dan and Bethel were packed. The temple in Jerusalem was packed. People were sacrificing animals by the hundreds and thousands. They were there for the feast days. They were there for all the religious emphases. They had a ritual. They did not have a relationship. They had the form of godliness, but they denied the power thereof by the fact that their lives were outwardly religious, but inwardly there was no faith. Now, in that atmosphere, we can see, though they looked very prosperous, and though it looked like a wonderful time, Amos looked through the eyes of faith and saw right through to the spiritual condition of this people. And though it looked like it was prosperous, though it looked like it was stable, though it looked like it was religious, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah said, this is sick. This is sick. They were trying to separate God's covenant from daily lifestyle. You see, during this period of prosperity, the middle class was getting walked on by the rich class. The poor were being abused. There's one passage here that says that these people, these rich people, were so jealous of the money that they resented the dirt that the poor put on their head as a sign of mourning. God help us. This had got so bad that justice went to the highest bidder. Bribery was rampant. There was no justice. The poor, the widow, the orphan, so much against the Deuteronomic emphasis was being abused and ostracized. It was sad. How much like our day, when power brokers and political backroomers seem to have the power, and how rampant injustice and crime and godlessness is. I think it's quite parallel. Now, I want you to think, lastly in this section on recipients, I want to deal with the prophets who were active. You've heard often of the 8th century prophets. They're very famous. In Judah, the prophets at this time were Micah, who was followed by Isaiah. In Israel, the prophets at this time were Amos, who was followed by Hosea. Now, if there's several major dates in the Old Testament, I keep telling my people at my church, if you'll memorize 4 or 5 dates in the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament will hang its hat right there, because the Old Testament is not in chronological order. I've already told you one. 922, the kingdom of Solomon split at his death between Jeroboam the first and Rehoboam the son of Solomon. Now, the next major date is that in 722, 200 years later, 40 years from when Amos wrote, not 40 years, about 27 years, the kingdom of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, are going to be taken in captivity by Assyria. And so here we have 27 years, and it's going to fall apart. And that's exactly what Amos is talking about. Now, 922, the kingdom split. 722, the northern 10 tribes captured by Assyria. And then a few years later, the southern 2 tribes are going to be captured by Babylon. That's 586. We got a few dates. 922, 722, 586. And then Babylon's going to fall later under Persia, and Cyrus is going to issue a decree that the Jews can go back home as he did for all peoples. Let's see. 538 is Cyrus's decree. If you can get those 4 dates, you'll have the Old Testament pretty much, you can hang your hat on it. So now, even though they're not right together, Micah, Isaiah, Amos, Hosea are right together. Now, let's look, if we could, at the central message that Amos proclaimed. There's 3 or 4 basic points. Number 1, God is sovereign. He is in control of nature. He is in control of history. He is in control of nations. He's in control of individuals. God is sovereign. Over Syria, over Egypt, over Judah and Israel, over all the earth. Now, secondly, God is ethical and moral. And that's what we really forget. Even the New Testament has so many books written to people who thought that they could worship God with knowledge or with emotion. Friends, knowledge and emotion is part of us. There's no way getting around it. But I want to tell you that if we know Him, we ought to live like He lived. Talking about 1 John language, if you please. God demands a lifestyle on the part of His people that reflects who He is. We ought to have Daddy's characteristics. And that's what these people had totally forgot. They'd separate justice and morality and ethics from ritual and covenant. They thought the covenant was set if they did the things God told them to do. And God said the covenant is only set not in what you do, but in who you are. Now, the second one is that His people must worship Him in faith and life. Not just ritual, faith and life. And that's, I guess, what I was saying about God's ethical and moral. Now, finally, covenantal privilege brings great responsibility. I'll put it in New Testament terms. To whom much is given, much is required. Now, remember, God chose the nation of Israel through Abraham to be a kingdom of priests, Exodus 19, 5 and 6. They were to bring all the world to God by being an example of His love and the revelation that God had given them. What a sad thing it is when great privilege is somehow turned inward into great selfishness, and faith is brought to the level of outward ritual only. Now, I want to give you a brief outline of the book if I can, and we're going to put up a full-page graphic so you can see where I'm going. I'll fill it in for you some, and you have it on your sheets. Let's see that full page if we could. There's the 4 major elements: charges against the nations, charges against Israel, special visions, and messianic hope. Now, you know, if I came to see you and I was trying to get your attention and I walked in and just blasted you, you probably wouldn't listen to me, would you? But what if I came in and started picking on somebody you didn't like? What if I came in and started predicting doom and judgment to some of your traditional enemies? You'd perk up, wouldn't you? You'd kind of say, "Get 'em, preacher, get 'em." Well, that's exactly what Amos did. He started out with the 3 nations that aren't any way related to the Hebrew people. And let me give you those. You might want to write them in if you have an outline. They're there. He started out against Damascus, which was the major enemy of the northern kingdom this whole period. And that's in chapter 1, 3 through 5. And then he went to Philistia, which is the traditional enemy, you know, back in the times of Samson and all that. And for years in there, chapter 1, 6 through 8. And then he went to Phoenicia. Now, that was the place where Jezebel came from. And that's chapter 1, 9, and 10. Now he's going to go to 3 near relatives of Israel, of the Jewish people: Edom, Ammon, and Moab. And then he's going to sneak right in and have charges against Judah. And I could just hear those folks saying, "Yeah, those Judeans, speak to them, get them." And then, bang, it was too late. He turned on them. And so he begins to speak against Israel in chapter 2, verses 6 through 16. And this is followed by an extensive list of charges against Israel that covers the vast bulk of the book, 3:1 through 6:14. And then there's a section that changes completely in the type of language it is. It's a series of visions. Now, some think, because Amos mentioned it in Amos 1:1, that maybe that's why the vision should be his call to the ministry and go first. But we're not sure that's the same visions. In this section, he uses natural phenomenon, which he was used to as a sheep herder and a farmer and a agricultural businessman, to describe God's judgment coming on the nation of Israel. He uses locusts in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, fire in chapter 7, verses 4 through 6, a plumb line, which is, of course, a construction metaphor that you see a wall straight with. So weight on a string that determined the straightness of a wall. Now in this section, the high priest from Bethel comes and tries to thwart his message. And nobody else messed with Amos after this. He told this man, said, not only are your family going to captivity, they're going to be killed, and you're going to be killed too. Ooh. Boy, Amos was nobody to pick on, I want to tell you. He just came in, he hadn't a whole lot of flowers. He just went right to the heart of the matter, and nobody bugged him after that. Now, in number 4, the summer fruit is chapter 8, verses 1 through 14. And then the destruction of the sanctuary, where God stands by the altar in judgment, is 9, 1 through 10. And then finally, and many commentators say this is a later edition, but I don't think so, the book closes out with a messianic hope. And you see that in 9, 11 through 15. And what this is basically is Amos's message was judgment. Oh, it was a hard, fiery judgment message. But in the midst of the tunnel of God's judgment, which they were about to enter, God says, there's a light in this tunnel, and I love you, and I'll be with you, and I'll forgive you. I'll bring you back. Have faith in me. That's just the way the Bible is. It finishes all these words of judgment with this great word of hope. Now, usually in introductions, I present some commentaries that I think are good. I don't believe there's any good commentaries out in the book of Amos. The 2 major series that I use over and over, which are the New International Commentary series and the Tyndale series, neither one of them have a section on Amos yet. Other series that I use, the Broadman Commentary, is fair but not real good. There's several books out on minor prophets that are fair but not good. There's just not a real good commentary out on Amos, so any one you get will be fine. And as you study through this with us, any commentary you have that you'll read before you listen to this lesson will be appropriate. I hope every time you study the Bible, number 1, you pray for God's Holy Spirit to speak to you, because if He doesn't, no learning will take place. Number 2, read the chapters in Amos we're going to be dealing with in 2 different English translations, the one you usually use, and then find another one and start asking yourself questions before you ever come to the teaching time. If you have a Bible commentary on the whole Bible or any commentary on Amos, read it, look at it, and then I think when you hear this that we can you'll be better able to work through it as we do that. I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.